The stage was bathed in amber light, soft and holy like the last breath of day before darkness takes over. At the center stood a woman with silver hair falling freely over her shoulders, her black jacket buttoned high. To her throat her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from memory. Patti Smith, the woman who once taught the world that art could be rebellion, and rebellion could be prayer. The crowd at Carnegie Hall rose in silence, no flashing lights, no explosions, just her voice weathered, cracked, luminous. When she sang, it was as if every scar she ever carried was turning into sound. For 50 years, she had been the patron saint of outsiders, the living pulse of punk. She had survived lost, death, obscurity, and revival. She had turned the noise of the streets into hymns for the broken, yet that night her gaze held something unspoken between the verses. Her eyes searched the dark as if trying to recognize a face she'd never met. It wasn't fame or age that haunted her. It was the truth that had been waiting her entire life to be revealed months later on November 4th. 2025, that truth would finally be spoken to the world in her memoir, Bread of Angels. The book was unlike anything she had written before. More confession than chronicle, more prayer than prose. Within its 288 pages lay the revelation that the man she had called her father all her life, Grant Smith, was not the man who had given her blood. She had dreamed of this book long before she ever wrote it in her sleep. A vision had come, a white book glowing in her hands, blank and weightless, as if waiting to be filled. When she woke, her arms were still raised, her fingers curved around air that felt alive. She did not yet know that dream was a doorway that one day would open to everything she thought she understood about love, family, and self. The woman who once sang a divine anarchy now faced a different kind of rebellion, the one within her own heart, because sometimes the greatest revolutions don't begin with guitars or riots. They begin in silence, with a single line written in trembling ink: love eclipses blood. And from that silence, the story of Patti Smith began again. Before she was a godmother of punk, before the roar of electric guitars and the fevered chant of crowded halls, Patti Lee Smith was a small, frail girl with tangled hair and eyes that always looked a little too far beyond. She was born in 1946 in the chill of a Chicago winter, when the streets were filled with the noise of factories and the smell of metal and rain. Her parents were working people, quiet, devoted, weary. Grant Smith, her father, spent his days surrounded by machines, his nights surrounded by books. He was a man who believed that poetry could live even in the hands of the poor. He didn't have much to give his daughter, no riches, no grand inheritance, but he gave her something rarer, the belief that words had weight. He would read aloud in the evenings, sometimes from the Bible, sometimes from Whitman or Blake. His voice was slow and deliberate, carrying a kind of reverence that turned their small kitchen into a cathedral. Patti listened, memorizing the rhythm of syllables, the holy sound of language. She didn't yet understand that this man who shaped her spirit was not bound to her by blood. To her, he was truth itself. Her mother, Beverly, was a gentler wind in that house of iron and paper, a waitress, a dreamer, a woman who carried faith like a lamp in a storm. She hummed while she worked, sang softly to her children, and often looked at the sky as if asking for something unseen to watch over them. Patti would later say that her mother's prayers became a melody that followed her through life, the quiet counterpoint to her father's literature. They were not a family of comfort. There were winters when the pipes froze, when dinner was thin and the blankets thinner. But poverty, in its strange way, gave her imagination. Texture. The walls of her childhood home were plain, yet inside her mind they were painted with visions, angels. Cities, lost saints, far away, places where people turned their pain into art. As she grew, she became restless. The churches her mother took her filled her with both awe and rebellion. She loved the hymns, but questioned the authority. She would stare at the crucifix and wonder why holiness always looked so sorrowful. The teachers at school called her strange. She preferred daydreams to obedience, scribbles to obedience. That girl lives in another world. They would whisper they weren't wrong. One night, when she was barely a teenager, she dreamed of a book. It was white, without title or author, and it pulsed faintly like something alive in the dream, a figure neither man nor woman placed in her hands. When she woke, her arms were still outstretched, her palms open. She couldn't shake the image. It felt like a secret that belonged to her and no one else. That vision haunted her through adolescence, through nights of hunger and mornings of prayer. She never told her parents. How could she? It wasn't a dream. It was a calling. In those early years, she found solace in libraries. She read Rambo Ghani and the Bible with equal devotion. She copied verses into her notebook, circling words that glowed: mercy, faith, blood, redemption. She didn't know yet that these words would become the script of her own life. There were moments when she sensed something unsaid between her parents, glances, pauses, a kind of silence that hums with hidden meaning. She ignored it. Every family had its shadows. What mattered was that they loved her, that her father encouraged her art, that her mother believed she was meant for something beyond the small world. They inhabited the Smiths, eventually moved to New Jersey, trading the industrial noise of Chicago. For the muted hum of the suburbs, the new house was small, but clean, with sunlight spilling through thin curtains. Patti would walk to the fields at dawn, notebook in hand, talking to herself like a prophet in training. Sometimes she'd sit beneath a tree and read Blake aloud. Convinced that angels were listening, no one could have guessed that within this strange, shy girl lived a storm. No one could have known that the dream of that glowing white book, so gentle, so holy, would one day return not as a vision of destiny, but as a mirror of her bloodline in the stillness of that childhood, surrounded by poverty poetry. In prayer, the first threads of Patti Smith's mythology were woven, and somewhere in the loom of heaven, fate smiled, quietly already knowing that one day the child who prayed for angels would become one herself through pain, through art, through truth. When Patti turned 20, the small world of Woodbury, New Jersey, could no longer hold the fire inside her. She was restless, brimming with words that burned her throat, with dreams too large for a factory town. One morning in 1967, she packed a single bag, a sketchbook, a few clothes, and a warm copy of Illuminations by Arthur Rimbaud, and boarded a bus to New York City. She had $40 in her pocket, and an unshakable belief that art would be her salvation. The city was both cruel and divine. The air was thick with noise, jazz from basement bar sirens wailing. Strangers shouting poetry. Survived. New York was where saints and sinners lived side by side, and Patti was both. She slept on park benches, skipped meals, and worked odd jobs to stay alive. There were nights when hunger made her dizzy, but her spirit never bent. I was young, she would write later, and I thought beauty could save us all. It was in the summer heat of that year that she met Robert Mapplethorpe, a young artist with eyes like blue fire and hands that seemed to shape light itself. They met by accident in a bookstore on 8th Avenue, both clutching the same book, a volume of mystical poetry. It was a moment destiny reached down and signed her name together. They built a world of their own, two hungry souls, sharing a single heartbeat. They moved into the Chelsea Hotel, the crumbling cathedral of artists and misfits, where every room told a story of creation, and collapsed. Janis Joplin, Leonard Cohen, Dylan Thomas. Their ghosts wandered the hallways like saints without altars. Patti and Robert had no money, but they had faith in the power of art, faith in each other, faith that their names would one day matter. Days were spent sketching, writing, or scavenging thrift shops for old clothes, and picture frames. Nights were for coffee, cigarettes, and the endless conversations that only the very young and the very desperate can afford. When she recited her poems to Robert, he listened with the devotion of a believer hearing scripture. You are my muse, he told her. She smiled and said, you are my mirror. The years in the Chelsea were both magic and misery. They lived close to starvation, but the city fed them with its chaos. She drew inspiration from the alleys of graffiti, the rhythm of the subways. It was all a symphony of survival. Then came 1975, a year the world heard her voice for the first time. She stood in a studio barefoot, her dark hair wild, her eyes defiant. The album was Horses, a photograph on the cover, taken by Robert, captured everything. She was half sane, half outlaw, timeless and raw. When it was released, it was as if someone had split open the sky. The critics called it revolutionary, musicians called it sacred. Patti just called it honest. Her words weren't lyrics, they were invocations on stage. She was electric, shouting, weeping, blessing. She didn't perform, she transformed. Each show was a ritual, a storm of sound and faith. People who came to laugh ended up crying. She wasn't selling rebellion, she was selling resurrection. As fame found her, Patti remained untamed. She didn't chase glamour, didn't bow to the music industry's demands. I'm not a rock star, she said. I'm a worker in the light. Yet even as her name began to echo across continents, even as she became a voice of a generation, she could not shake the quiet unease that sometimes visited her in sleep and her dreams. She still saw that glowing white book, the same one she had held as a child. Its pages were beginning to open now, letters forming across the blank paper, words she could not yet read. She told no one she just wrote. Every poem, every song was an attempt to understand the language of that dream. And though she had escaped poverty, loneliness still shadowed her. She often said that fame felt like being seen through glass, close to the world, but untouchable still. She sang, she wrote, she survived. She turned pain into melody and doubt into scripture. The girl from Chicago had become a woman who made poetry out of fire. She had risen not to conquer, but to bear witness, to prove that creation itself was an act of faith. And yet even in her triumph, destiny was quietly waiting in the wings. The white book still glowed in the dark. Fame, when it finally came, did not knock. It roared. The girl who once scribbled verses by candlelight, was suddenly the voice of a generation that didn't believe in salvation, yet found in her words Horses was more than an album. It was a declaration. It shattered conventions, mixing poetry and punk tenderness and rage. Critics called it spiritual chaos, urban scripture. Patti simply called it truth. The world wanted to claim her. She became the reluctant prophet of an era that worshipped noise and disobedience. Her concerts were not performances. They were awakenings. Crowds stood transfixed as she howled verses like prayers, each line a rebellion against despair. Her voice cracked and soared, reaching beyond gender, beyond genre. She was neither woman nor man, neither saint nor sinner. She was both all at once. By the late 1970s, Patti Smith was everywhere. She sang on world stages. Her black and white image emblazoned on posters and album covers. Bob Dylan sought her advice. Bruce Springsteen wrote because a night for her, and Rolling Stone called her the poet laureate of punk, yet fame sat uneasily on her shoulders. She wore like a heavy coat. She could never take off. I want a freedom, she once said, but fame is a cage that sings your song back to you until you can't tell if it's still yours. So she walked away at the height of her power. Patti did what few artists dared. She disappeared in 1980. She married Fred Sonic Smith, guitarist of the MC5, a man who shared her reverence for art and her distrust of the spotlight. They moved to Detroit into a modest house far from the chaos of the city that had made her for 17 years. She lived quietly. She raised 2 children. She tended a garden. She cooked dinner. The woman who once electrified arenas was now reading bedtime stories. Yet even in this domestic calm, her creativity pulsed like a hidden current. She filled journals with sketches, poems, and prayers. When children slept, she wrote by lamplight, her handwriting small and precise. But life, as always, demanded sacrifice. In 1994, Fred died suddenly of heart failure. Her brother Todd, who had been her anchor since childhood, passed away soon after. The world she had built with such tenderness collapsed. I felt she would later write, as if the earth had turned its face away. Grief could have silenced her. Instead, it brought her back. She returned to music, her voice rougher, now her gaze clearer. She no longer sang for fame, but for survival. The stage that once felt like a battlefield became her sanctuary. In 2010, she released Just Kids, a memoir that traced her bond with Robert Mapplethorpe, their poverty, their dreams, their art is death. From AIDS, the book was a masterpiece, earning her National Book Award and the devotion of a new generation. For many, it was the first time they met the poet beneath the icon. Then came Train Year, The Monkey, and finally the dream that had been following her since girlhood, Bred of Angels. She began writing it in fragments, almost in secret, unsure what it wanted to become. It started as reflections on faith, loss, and the strange objects we keep to remember who we were. But soon it began pulling her towards something deeper, truth buried not in her mind, but in her blood. The white book from her dream was no longer a symbol. It was a summons. One night, as rain hammered her window in New York, Patti opened an old box of family photographs. The edges were frayed, the colors fading. Her father's eyes looked back at her, kind, patient, familiar. But for the first time, she felt a shadow between them, something unnamed. It wasn't doubt, not yet only a whisper, a quiet question that would grow louder until it broke her life open. The fame, the poetry, the rebellion, all of it had been a prelude. What waited next would not be about music or art. It would be about identity, blood, and forgiveness. And this time, her greatest revelation would not come from the stage, but from science. It began quietly, the way earthquakes do, deep beneath the surface. Unannounced, Patti had been gathering memories for Bred of Angels, weaving them like threads of lace. Through her reflections on art and faith, the book was supposed to be gentle, a meditation on the sacredness of everyday objects. Her father's tools, her mother's rosary, the dress she wore on her wedding day. The title came from an old prayer she loved, "Give us this day our bread of angels." It was to be about nourishment, not revelation. But destiny had other plans. One afternoon in 2012, she received an email from her daughter, her first child, the one she had given up for adoption at 20, and later reunited with the daughter, grown and radiant, had been exploring genealogy as a hobby mom. She wrote, "You should try one of these DNA kits. It's fascinating." Patti smiled. She had always believed that her story was already written, but she agreed out of curiosity to join in weeks later. The results arrived. She opened the report, casually expecting numbers, percentages, maybe a few distant cousins. Instead, what she saw unstitched her world. Her DNA didn't match the man she had always called her father, Grant Smith, the man who had taught her kindness, who had read her poetry as a child, who had filled her imagination with faith and music, was not her biological parent. At first, she thought it must be a mistake. She called the company, demanded reanalysis, took the test again. The results were the same or true. Father, the report suggested, was someone named Sidney Ashkenazi, Jewish roots of life, cut short decades ago, a man no one had ever told. Her about she sat in silence, the paper trembling in her hands it was. As if a lifetime of certainty had dissolved in an instant, the air in her apartment felt different, thinner, sharper. The world didn't tilt, it receded. She could still hear her father's laugh, still feel his callous hands on her shoulders. Yet something had shifted. The stories of her childhood, every prayer, every Sunday dinner, suddenly floated in the air like fragments of a dream. For 2 years, she couldn't write. The woman who had faced death, grief, and loneliness now found herself paralyzed by something smaller, quieter, the rearrangement of truth. She tried to pray, but words fell like stones. She turned to music, but the strings stayed mute beneath her fingers. She began walking through cemeteries, searching for peace among the names of the dead. She said, I want to feel close to him, but I didn't know which him. I was mourning. Then her daughter became a detective with the patience of love. She traced names through ancestry websites, spoke to distant relatives, dug through records older than Patti herself. The search took months, then years. At last, she found him, Sidney, a quiet man from another world who died before Patti ever took the stage. No photographs, no letters, only fragment, a record of marriage, a faded document mentioned in a local obituary. Her mother's silence began to make sense. She remembered the old woman's eyes, their flicker of sadness whenever the past came near. Before her final illness, she had whispered something, half a confession, but the words were lost in the static of time. When the truth settled, Patti did not rage. She wept, but softly. She said, I felt as though I had stepped into a story written long before I was born, and all I could do was finish it. She came to see the revelation not as betrayal, but as grace. Her father, Grant, had loved her as his own. That love was real, untouched by DNA. Sidney, her biological father, was part of her story, to a man whose absence shaped her just as powerfully as presence. Love eclipses blood, she wrote, and in that sentence she found her way back to the page. Bread of Angels became a map of that journey, the shock, the silence, the surrender. She wrote of memory, not as history, but as prayer. She wrote of her daughter's search as an act of divine symmetry. Quoting Blake, fearful symmetry, the phrase echoed through every chapter, binding the science of ancestry with the mystery of faith in interviews. She said she wanted readers to know they weren't alone. She said many people discover truths late in life that change everything, but maybe that's what life is, an unfolding. The truth comes when we're strong enough to bear it. The punk poet who once screamed against the world had found a new rebellion peace. And somewhere, maybe beyond time, 2 fathers watched her. One who gave her words, one who gave her blood, both now immortal through her forgiveness. When Bread of Angels finally saw the light of day, it arrived not as a book, but as a benediction. Patti Smith held the first printed copy in her trembling hands and smiled, not the smile of triumph, but of peace. The cover was simple, her name in modest lettering, a faint image of white cloth beneath it. To anyone else it might have seemed ordinary, to her it was the fulfillment of a vision she had carried since childhood. The white book from her dream, finally made real by the time she began promoting it. Patti had already come to terms with the secret that had once broken her. She no longer spoke of the discovery with pain, but with wonder. In interviews, she was calm, almost radiant, as if the act of revelation had transformed her. It was never about the DNA, she said softly. It was about seeing the truth and then deciding what to do with it. What she did with it was forgiveness, not the easy, shallow kind that demands forgetting, but the fierce, luminous kind that burns away bitterness and leaves only compassion. She forgave her mother, who had kept the secret to protect her. She forgave the silence that had hovered over their family for decades. She even forgave fate itself for withholding the truth until she was strong enough to carry it. It's strange, she told one journalist, how revelation can feel like resurrection. You die to the story you believed, and then you rise into the story that was waiting for you. All along, the book, she explained, was not about scandal or shock. It was about light, about how truth, even when it hurts, can illuminate the heart. She hoped readers would see themselves in it, not the celebrity, not the poet, but the human being who learned that love is thicker than blood. She wrote of her father, Grant, as she always remembered him, the man who smelled of oil and paper, who built model airplanes and read poetry by lamplight. He may not have been my biological father, but he was the father my soul chose. Those words became a touchstone for readers across the world, especially for those who had grown up with fractured families or who discovered late in life that their origins were not what they believed. Letters poured and people shared their own stories of hidden fathers, secret adoptions, DNA revelations that shattered and mended them in equal measure. Patti read every letter. She said, we are all part of each other's myth. When one person tells the truth, another person is freed. Her life slowed after that. She spent long mornings riding by the window of the city, humming quietly below. Sometimes she'd pause, close her eyes, and whisper a prayer for people who were still searching for their own peace. She had learned that art was not about explaining pain, but transforming it. Even her performance's change gone was a raw, furious energy that once defined her. In its place was something gentler, more deliberate. She would walk on stage, bow her head, and begin not with a scream, but a sigh. The audience still roared for her, but she no longer sought her approval. She was offering them something holier, honesty, during a reading in Venice. She said, "Every song, every poem I've ever written has been about love, even the angry ones, even the broken ones. I think I finally understand that now." The crowd fell silent for a long moment. No one moved. They simply breathed with her. "And bread of angels," she wrote, "I believe we are all made of. Stories, not cells. DNA may tell us who we come from, but only love tells us who we are." The press called the memoir haunting, intimate, divine. But Patti didn't care about reviews. She cared about resonance, the quiet ripple that spreads when one heart recognizes another. Her revelation had not destroyed her faith. It had deepened it. She saw now that the white book from her dream had been a promise, that truth, no matter how late it arrives, is a form of grace, and grace, once received, demands to be shared. The punk priestess had become something even rarer, a messenger of mercy. The final chapter of Bread of Angels closes not with a declaration, but with a whisper. Patti writes that every life, no matter how tangled or uncertain, moves toward clarity. In the end, the way dawn dissolves night without effort. And so when she stood again beneath the lights of Carnegie Hall 50 years after she first dared to scream poetry into a microphone, she was not there to prove anything. She was there to give thanks. Her hair, now a long river of silver, caught the stage lights. Like strands of memory, her voice, cracked, lower, unpolished, carried the weight of decades, and yet it was gentle, almost tender. She sang, because the night not as an anthem, but as a prayer. Her audience was older now, two men and women who had grown up with her words, who had carried their own losses, their own secrets. Many wept silently, their faces lifted toward her like pilgrims receiving a final blessing between songs. She spoke not of fame or art, but of faith, the kind that outlives religion. "I wrote this book," she said, "for the people who think it's too late to forgive, too late to begin again, too late to love. I'm here to tell you, it's never too late. Love waits. It always waits." For a moment, the room was so quiet that even the sound of breathing felt sacred. Someone in the balcony whispered, "Thank you." And she smiled, small and shy, as if embarrassed by holiness. After the show, she lingered on stage, staring into the darkened rows of empty seats. "They think I'm strong," she murmured to her friend beside her, "but I'm just grateful." Outside, the night was cool. New York skyline shimmered like the surface of a dream. She walked slowly down the street, her hands in her pockets, humming to herself. Somewhere far away, church bells began to ring. At 78, Patti Smith had become what she was always meant to be, not just a musician or a poet, but a living testament to endurance. She had turned rebellion into reverence, tragedy into teaching, truth into tenderness. Her legacy wasn't carved into gold records or awards. It lived in the quiet hearts of those who found courage in her story. Through Bread of Angels, she had given the world one final sermon: that love is not bound by blood, that forgiveness is not weakness, that art, when born from honesty, can heal what science cannot touch. As she wrote in the last line of her book, "All I ever wanted was to write one true sentence. And if this is it, let it stand as my prayer." And somewhere in the silence that follows, you can almost hear her voice, fragile, eternal, whispering what she has known all along: love is always enough.